Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It's not every day that a Canadian premier catches the attention of the U.S. president, but that's exactly what's happened in recent days.
Canada got caught cheating on a commercial. Can you believe it?
U.S. President Trump reacted angrily to a television commercial put out by Ontario Premier Doug Ford.
The intention wasn't to go poke the president in the eye. My intention was to get a conversation going, wake up the Democrats a little bit down there.
The taxpayer-funded ad, which was running in the United States, used Ronald Reagan's own words from a 1987 radio address.
High tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars.
Trump saw the ad and reacted angrily to it, canceling Canada-U.S. trade talks because of it. I'm Richard Southern. Today on The Big Story, we ask the question, did Ontario's premier derail Canada-U.S. trade negotiations? Joining us is John Wright. He's the CEO of Canada Pulse Insights and a veteran pollster. John, thanks so much for being with us here in The Big Story. It's good to have you back.
Great to be with you, Richard.
So John, do you think this was a big political misstep by Ontario Premier Doug Ford? His commercial causing the collapse of Canada-U.S. trade talks. He's still defending the commercial, John, but was this a big political misstep by the Ontario Premier?
No, I don't think so, but we've had days to kind of figure out what the nature of the reverberation is around it. And I think, like many other people in this country, the president is mercurial, and he may have stepped on this himself to do something to change the agenda in the United States, and it means that almost anything could have happened. But I want to go to this a little bit differently, because the federal government, while the Prime Minister said the other day that, we have, 13 premiers and one federal government, and it's important for us all to be on the same page. I'm not sure what that page is. You've got constituencies in the province of Ontario that the premier has to look out for. He's got the auto sector already experiencing layoffs. He's got aluminum and steel. He's got lumber as well. And so while the prime minister might say, well, listen, I'm not going to negotiate in public, you can't leave the other premiers kind of, saying, well, to their constituencies, let's wait until the federal government's got a deal. So you take a look across the country and you've got, Danielle Smith, who's been front and center, trying to court the Americans on a number of different occasions. But she's now hoping to get something out of the prime minister on pipelines and shipping of gas and oil. But you've also got Scott Moe, who's hoping that there is going to be some conclusion on the Chinese file, and to try and, if it means getting EVs from China and canola settled out. That's one way of him speaking out within the context of trade. But you also have the Premier of British Columbia, David Eby, who's going out of the gates with his own advertising. So I think in one way, yes, the Premier put something out there and the president jumped on it, although in the earliest stages, he wasn't vexed by it as much as he was a couple of days later. But I think it also is a vacuum that needs to be filled. You cannot expect premiers or leaders of constituencies simply to sit back and say, I'm going to let the feds take this thing, and tell the constituencies, you know what, I'm done fighting for the time being. I'm going to keep my powder dry. That's not how this works. And in hindsight, while I might have at the beginning as an advisor said, I think you better watch your step here. I think that at the end of the day, the premier's got some good political capital that he may have even increased in the province of Ontario.
But at the same time, John, the Prime Minister, I'm going to play you a clip here of Prime Minister Carney earlier this week. He was pretty clear that it was this commercial that kind of derailed the trade talks, which sounded like they were really moving ahead well. Here's the Prime Minister from just a few days ago.
Had been making progress. As ads came, the President had the reactions which you have seen, and we're in the situation we're in.
It sounds, does it not, like the commercial kind of just ruined everything as far as the talks were concerned?
Again, I have to say, I don't know whether it did or it didn't, because there was a lag between the president acknowledging the ad and when he finally decided to turn the heat on and turn the trade talks off. Like, I don't know anybody. I mean, this is a president that, wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to demolish the east wing of the White House and put up a gargantuan ballroom. I mean, no rules seem to apply. This is not negotiation in a structured way. This is the whim of the president in deciding what he's going to do. So who knows whether that was even a deflection from other things. The reality is this. In this country, the negotiations are obviously difficult and constrained behind closed doors. That's the way the prime minister wants to deal with things. But you can't simply say to people who have gone out on CNN, like the premier, and who have been meeting with governors in the States and who have tried to make a platform to fight for their own province, to say, look, for the next 3 months, everybody shut up and go behind closed doors. It's not going to happen. So there will be a constituency who says that the premier put this ad out and the president, legitimately decided he was going to walk away from the table because of it. He was insulted. There's no way this should take place. But there's equally a constituency that looks at it and says, you know what? It wouldn't have mattered. If the premier of British Columbia had put an advertisement out, as he's going to do, before Mr. Florida, it might have been that. So I don't think you can pin the tail of the donkey blame-wise on Ontario or the premier for this. I just think that you can't expect everybody to simply say to the federal government, you got this, because there are too many constituencies that are going to get hit in Ontario. They're already being hit, and he's got to expend the political capital to make it, appropriate that he's trying to fight back for his own province.
I had a chance earlier this week to catch up with Ontario Premier Doug Ford John at a news conference, and he was kind of saying, "Hey, listen, I see this ad as a success because so many people saw it." And I asked him if he, in light of the trade talks collapsing, if he felt he owed the people of Ontario an apology. After all, he spent millions of Ontario taxpayer dollars on this ad. So here's me and the Premier from earlier this week.
We achieved our goal, as we say, mission accomplished, it was done.
Premier, the Prime Minister was explicit today in saying that it was the ad that derailed negotiations which were moving ahead. With that in mind, why don't you feel you owe Ontarians an apology?
For sticking up for Ontarians, well, let's talk about a so-called imminent deal. I've been hearing this for month after month after month, and if there was no mention about auto. He wants to take jobs from Ontario. That's what he's trying to do, and I'll keep fighting. And I'll never apologize for fighting for the hardworking people.
Is that spin, do you think, John, or does he have a point there?
Well, if it is, then I just spent the last 3 minutes of spinning. I think he has a point.
What was that ad intended to do in the United States? I mean, to convince, who was it trying to convince?
Well, I think it was trying to make sure that constituencies in Washington and other places knew that the position of the Ontario government was that tariffs were not the right thing.
They didn't know that? They didn't know that already?
Yeah, but again, you can't have Canadian car companies, being attacked or moved out of this country, and especially out of your own province, and do nothing. Like, you can't do that. So this was the Ontario government's form of doing it. And as I said, it happened that it was an ad that went that for the first couple of days, the president didn't do anything. He acknowledged it, but then something must have happened.
The Reagan Foundation weighed in, right? And it said that the ad was taken out of context, which I don't think it really was. I mean, the lines of the commercial were lifted from a 5-minute speech, but I don't think it changed the point of Reagan's 87 address, what he was trying to say, right?
Well, I mean, honestly, it was a straight shooting ad in taking the information from what the president had said. I mean, you can go and watch the entire speech that he said. And you have to say that, politics in the United States is enormously influenced by the president. So if you're sitting in a library representing the former president's legacy, what are you going to do? I mean, it's a country that you really can't rely on almost anybody to back the truth up. You don't know what's going to happen to them in retaliation. So again, I look at this and say, there are constituencies that have to be assured that the premier is out fighting for. The tariffs are there to be negotiated, but we don't know if there is any negotiation. We're putting our faith in the Prime Minister and even his trek to Asia that he's going to open up doors. But you and I know that those doors opening are not going to be swung open to have that trade relationship for years. I mean, it's not going to turn on the tap tomorrow. So the premier has to do what he's got to do. And I think he hasn't changed his stripes. I mean, love him or hate him, this premier is predictable, and he's been carrying this torch for Ontarians since we got into the tariff tussle with the United States, and nothing has really changed. I think, going forward, this will settle down, but it could well be another one. Look, as well, remember that Howard Lutnick, who's involved in negotiating this, was in a Chatham House forum with hundreds of people at the Eurasia BMO summit just a month ago, who basically said, you know what that sucking sound is? We're taking all the car companies out of Canada, and you're going to have to get, things to replace all of that. Like, you're the premier of the province, of which the impact of this is incredible to the suppliers right across the board. And somebody who is on the negotiating team, who sits right next to the president, is saying, you know what, bye-bye, that entire landscape's going to be changed. I don't know what you do other than you put it right in their face and you say, you know what, we're going to continue on the way we are and fight this as best we can. So you could argue that it caused a derailment. On the other hand, I don't know whether it did, but what I do know is that this premier has played, straight up since getting involved in this debate, and he's been using the same tools and the same approach and the same platform as he did at the beginning as he is now.
We can't talk about this sort of commercial, I guess, without talking about the interesting relationship between the Ontario Premier and Prime Minister Mark Carney. Ford, arguably, John, the most prominent conservative, most successful conservative politician in Canada right now. He's praised the Liberal Mark Carney right from the get-go when he announced his intention to run for leadership of the federal Liberals. And they've really only butted heads over one issue, and that's kind of this approach with the United States, where, Ford has argued we got to hit them and hit them hard, was his exact quote, I believe, where the Prime Minister said last week, no, I don't believe in that. Now is the time for talking, said Carney. So can you speak, John, to this interesting dynamic between these two leaders and how they've kind of split on this one issue?
Well, I can only speak as an observer of, the political landscape. I'm not an insider to anything, but I will simply say they are two very, very different politicians, because Mark Carney hasn't been a politician. I mean, he's been close to it. He's been around it, but I would see him more as a CEO, a director of the board, who is very comfortable in a room talking to leaders and having thoughts on how a country is going to be dealt with and what needs to be done to structure the budget and the deficit, all those things. I mean, he is a critical part of the dialogue that takes place in the political classes across this country. But I look at Doug Ford, and he's a retail politician. He's going to be pragmatic, as he was with Chrystia Freeland, and he will be with Mark Carney, and he will be with others. He doesn't blow people off in that way, and if he does do something, he may come out and apologize for it, either in front of large groups of people or even behind the scenes. But the styles are remarkably different. Doug Ford comes from City Hall. He's a retail politician. There's no huge, strategy for the province. And I'm not saying it's good or bad, but if you look back in other premiers, they've had, a vision of where we're going and what we're doing. What we have here is a premier who has been exactly the same as he got into the chair. That is, I'm going to deal with speed cameras. I'm going to cut red tape out so you get more money in your back pocket. Like, we're not dealing with a premier who's thinking in a larger capacity about where his province is going. He's down right at street level. So I don't think you could find two more different people from an education, from an experience point of view, and from a point of view of politics than what you've got. But what we've seen with Doug Ford is he's able to navigate that. This may be the big issue in the last few days and maybe for a couple to come. But I tell you, if the Blue Jays win, and I hope they do, the World Series, we'll be past this and on to something else in the following weeks. Also, you have to remember that Donald Trump himself has got this issue that's going to be before the Supreme Court. And he may be saying, look, I don't want anybody to talk about this stuff and remind anybody about anything until I've got that stuff dealt with. Who knows? But it is what it is. The ads were taken off. Anybody who's dealt with advertising knows that you can't just oftentimes, put the full stop to the train going forward. So it did play during 2 nights of the World Series, but it's now done. And I tell you, if it's not this ad, it will be something else that changes and whipsaws the trade negotiations in the not too distant future.
Yeah, it was done at the request of the Prime Minister, Ford said. Carney called him up, asked him to pull it off the air. The Prime Minister, John, he was brought to power this past spring on kind of his perceived ability to deal with Trump and to get a deal for Canada. Obviously, that deal has yet to materialize. You're a veteran pollster. That's kind of your primary job. How has the Prime Minister been polling in light of these negotiations not really going anywhere with the states?
Well, it's a great question because people are not putting their hope just in him to come up with a deal. I mean, there are other issues in this country that certainly have to be addressed: the cost of living, affordability. You could go through the pocketbook issue. These are things. Even the Bank of Canada cutting rates by another quarter point. I mean, these are the things that matter to people in the street. But when you talk to people about the federal government and its leadership, they get a sense of the persona. I mean, you and I know over all the years that we've covered politics that at the end of the day, the brand is defined by whoever's leading the party. And whoever's leading the Liberal Party right now, and Mark Carney, is getting good leadership reviews. And I think people are probably saying, you know what, I'll trust him and I hope things will happen. But it's also an occasion to look at the opposition and say, well, what's my alternative? And every poll that's been out shows that at least Pierre Poilievre, the Conservatives, are polling about 20 to 30 points behind where the Prime Minister is on his own accolades for leadership. So, look, it's working for the Prime Minister. But I would say this: when he held court just last week to talk about what was supposed to be, an outline of what we might hear in the budget, it fell flat because there was nothing there. I mean, the only people who really enjoyed what he had to say on national television that was, interrupted everything to hear what the Prime Minister had to say, the only people who really enjoyed it were, a handful of Liberal students who were, part of the Liberal Party council on, at the university. They thought it was just great. But for the rest of us, I think you sit back and go, that was an opportunity to put some meat on the bone, and we didn't get it. It goes to the whole issue of the trade negotiations too, where we're just, kind of in this suspended animation of let's trust Mark Carney. Let's, see what unfolds. We haven't got the there yet. It hasn't come in the budget. I know, they're announcing big plans, but, in terms of the big projects, but we haven't got shovels in the ground. There's the pursuit of trade relationships around the world to open up and pivot away from the Americans. We haven't seen any of that yet. So right now, 50% of the public is looking at the Prime Minister and saying, I think you've got the goods. But I also think, Richard, that there's a lot of Canadians who are from Missouri, which is the show me state. At some point in time, they're going to look at him and go, this is all interesting chatter, but I want to know exactly what you're going to deliver. And that, in fact, will be a very interesting time in this country where they have to choose either between Mr. Poilievre or Mr. Carney or somebody else, because they're going to want to see meat on the bone. And I don't think we see any of it right now.
And in the province of Ontario, despite there being some anger, I've heard that anger from some Ontarians about, their taxpayer dollars being used for this commercial. Despite that, Premier Ford still has very strong polling numbers, right? There's a lot of people that continue to support this now 3-term premier, John.
Yeah, and we have to remember that you and I and a group of others follow politics very, very closely, and we have for years and years and years. The common folk are not hearing or discussing what we've talked about. In fact, it may have blipped onto their radar screen a couple of days ago, and they're more interested in making sure that their jobs are secure, that they've got food on the table for their families, all those things at the retail level where the premier, in fact, gets the most impact. And as a result, this is a blip in a bigger picture where close to 50% of or more in the province of Ontario say, I would vote for that premier tomorrow. It is in the absence of a Liberal leader in the opposition, but that's a huge number. You and I know that in order to get a majority government in the province of Ontario, it takes roughly 37%. I mean, majorities are not founded on whole numbers, are founded on fractions because of the distribution of the vote and how many different parties that we have. For a premier to be sailing through all of this at 50 to 52%, and even in the city of Toronto, where I think he got 24% of the vote last time, he's sitting at 37% who say right now that he deserves to be reelected, that even on photo radar, he's getting half the public 44% are agreeing with his argument. Half the public basically say, okay, well, if you want to remove those photo radars, I'm in favor of it. And 63% would come on board if he kept them in the school zones, as a tweak to the policy. Even when it sounds like he's getting pummeled in certain areas, he's got way more support than he would normally have had in the city of Toronto and in other places during an election campaign. So, as I said from the very outset, look, this premier is a three-peat premier. He's got a huge majority. They can basically do what they want because there is no opposition leader. The advertisement is right up his alley. It's caused some problems perhaps in the negotiation, but we don't know whether or not that was going to happen anyway and something would get, stepped on. But what I do know is that it's his brand, and he can't stand on the sidelines, nor will he, because it's who he is. He won't stand on the sidelines and let all these car companies collapse and in play into the hands of Howard Lutnick that basically says that sucking sound is going to take all of those jobs away and we're going to put them all in the United States. He can't stand there and do nothing. And he can't sit on the sidelines and twiddle his thumbs and say to the prime minister, okay, you've got this and I'll just wait. So nothing's changed with this premier, and he's not going to apologize for it. And for all the kerfuffle that's going on, he's still sitting at half the public saying that he'd vote for him tomorrow.
Super interesting stuff. Not every day a Canadian premier gets the attention of the U.S. president. John, thanks so much for being here. We really appreciate it. John Wright, CEO of Canada Pulse Insights and a veteran pollster. Thanks, John, for being here on The Big Story.
My pleasure, Richard.
And that was The Big Story. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this conversation. You can find us on X at The Big Story FPN, or send us an email at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can see new episodes of The Big Story every morning, Monday through Friday, wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to leave us a comment or share with a friend. I'm Richard Southern. Thanks for listening.